Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Public History Podcast with Justin, Jake, and Molly. This is Jake Wynn, and I am joined by one of my lovely co-hosts, Molly Keilty. Molly, how are you?
Hello. Hello, Jake. I'm great. How are you today?
You know, managing, staying together, keeping it together as best we can in these strange times.
Listeners may be interested in. We saw each other in the flesh today.
Yes, we enjoyed a nice cup of coffee and talking about future podcast ventures. So it was a good time.
Cup of Joe and a little bit about this topic, which I'm
Yeah.
excited to get into.
Yeah, so we are going to discuss, this is going to be a short episode, and it's a little bit of a, we can call it a emergency-ish pod. I mean, it's kind of an emergency, but it's a slow-moving, all-encompassing emergency. It's just all around us.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit today about some history-related topics tied to the current conflict in Iran. I say conflict. It is a war. This is definitely an undeclared war. The United States Navy just sunk its first ship with a submarine since World War II. So it's definitely firmly in war territory here. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Sound good to you, Molly?
Sounds great. And I just saw breaking news that the Senate failed to pass it for the 8th time, I believe, the War Powers Act.
Yeah, so I think we're just going to be in this state of, I don't know, purgatory? War purgatory? For the foreseeable future. But so we, if you'll remember, our last episode was about the lovely HBO miniseries John Adams. We have been a little slow in getting the next ones out. So this is like a bridge episode between recaps of a show from 2008. And we just want to let you know, we're going to get back to that soon, but we wanted to make sure that we were continuing our, I don't know, what do you want to say, momentum, just continuing to have these conversations that, like Molly said earlier, we had in person, and wanted to bring them over here and talk a little bit about, again, some historical ties to the events that are going on currently in the Middle East, and ones that I don't think are necessarily being talked about. And something that I found interesting, that I just wanted to explore a little bit about. It's particularly about heritage sites and history sites in times of armed conflict. And we have a relevant example that I saw from the early stages of this conflict. And I wanted to bring up some things that I was interested in and share a little bit about them. And yeah, so that's kind of the genesis of this episode. And I think we'll go a little bit further beyond that as well towards the end of this, and just share our thoughts a bit about the conflict generally. And I have some other history tied thoughts about the current war as well. Before we go into that, is there anything else you want to add before we start, Molly?
No, I'm excited to dive into this and learn about it, because when you brought it up, it definitely wasn't something that I was thinking about. So you said, this is something rarely talked about, and I agree. So I'm glad that we're bringing it here.
Yeah, so this is, just to for future listeners who are wondering about the dark times in which we record this podcast, we are recording this on May 4th, and just
March 4th. He's so frazzled. Wait, I want to tell you why it's March 4th, and this better stay in. It's Exolano Day, which in ancient Greek, Exolano means to march forth. So it's a very special day in the Keilty family household, okay? I kid you
dang.
not. It's happy Exolano Day to everyone who celebrates.
Okay, well, yeah, now we're stuck leaving in my air. We regret the air, but now we all learned something. So it is March 4th, not May 4th. And thank you for adding in. I learned something new today, Molly. So
Happy Exolano Day to you, Jake.
happy Exolana Day to you as well, and to all who celebrate. So just a few days ago, on Saturday, February 28th, Israeli and U.S. forces initiated a war against Iran that has been going on ever since. This is the largest U.S. military operation since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, with about 50,000 troops, 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, and hundreds of aircraft participating. And As that bombardment was going on, story came out earlier this week that in one of the strikes, an apparent missile strike, there on Tehran, the capital of Iran, the Golestan Palace was damaged, blown out windows, some structural damage as well, it appears. And this caught my attention because this is a listed UNESCO World Heritage site. It's the city's only World Heritage site with ties back to the 15th century, with buildings constructed in the 18th century, and the site was kind of rebuilt and restored in the 19th century. And this caught my attention. We do talk about historic sites and museums, and this brought up an interesting topic of what happens in a massive conflict like we have now to these heritage sites, to our history and culture. Well, UNESCO put out a statement condemning the strike near the heritage site. And these sites, as I went down this rabbit hole about this palace and the damage it suffered, such sites are actually protected under the laws of war, specifically a 1954 treaty signed at The Hague that sought to protect cultural heritage and history sites in times of war. UNESCO, that is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they actually relay the geographic coordinates for UNESCO heritage sites in conflict zones. So they relayed these geographic coordinates of more than 24 UNESCO World Heritage sites throughout the country of Iran to the Israeli and United States governments as the conflict is breaking out, in order to basically say, do not strike these places. They are akin to, don't strike a hospital, or, under the laws of war, these are protected sites. And in this case, we have a nearby strike damaging one of those UNESCO World Heritage sites. So this sent me down this rabbit hole. I did not know this. You're shaking your head too, Molly.
I'm like, a question. So conflict breaks out and they immediately, what do they do? How do they alert, in this case, the United States and Israel, these are the coordinates, don't hit them? Do you know that?
I would presume that is going to go, since this is a United Nations organization, I would presume that would go through the ambassadors of each country to the United Nations. So that would probably be communicated to the American and Israeli ambassadors to the UN through those offices, that would be how those are distributed. But I did not see the specifics of that. So that's just my kind of somewhat informed assumption of how that communication.
I've never heard of that before. So that's really
interesting. Yeah, this was a first as well for me. So other things I found out about this. So the treaty was signed at the Hague in 1954. The United States was a part of that convention conference where these agreements are laid down. We're an original signer of that treaty, but the United States government did not ratify our agreement to that through Congress and then signed by the president until 2009, which actually shocked me. And had a lot to do with the politics of the Cold War and not signing on to kind of United Nations treaties. There are other treaties and other areas of legal agreement through the United Nations that the United States has not signed on to and continues to not sign on to. This was one of those until 2009. And I found that to be just fascinating. And that's a result of, kind of blowback to conflict in Afghanistan, but specifically of the Iraq War and the invasion in 2003, damage that was done to the Iraq National Museum in 2003 when we invaded Iraq, that led to the looting of that museum as well as of archaeological sites throughout the country. So there was some blowback there. The United States has been involved in incidents where these sites of cultural and historic importance have been damaged in the past, and that is part of how we get to signing on to that treaty officially and ratifying it in 2008, and then 2009 is when it is officially ratified.
Because we were guilty of destroying some of these sites. Right.
Yes, we played a role in that. And this has been, this is a topic not since we created the podcast, but in recent years, this issue has come to the forefront. Some may remember when kind of the Islamic State, ISIS, was participating in destruction of historic and archaeological sites across Syria and Iraq in the 2010s. The Taliban participated in this in Afghanistan, destroying cultural sites. There have been other incidents in places like Bosnia in the 1990s where historic sites were destroyed deliberately as well. So this is something that is a very relevant part of modern conflict, modern warfare that is not really discussed. And so so we wanted to talk a little bit about that, and just bring that up as a topic of conversation that's one that we have to think about in the 21st century, about when we're thinking about public history, when we're thinking about how we interact with these historic sites, the archaeological sites, cultural sites that exist in these conflict zones.
Yeah, I was completely ignorant on this topic. So when you mentioned that the Golestan Palace had been, um, I guess, damaged, not destroyed,
Mhm.
I was like, well, what is a UNESCO World Heritage Site? So I went on and did a little research about the 10 different criteria they have for establishing if it's culturally significant. And that includes also, I saw, and I don't know if this is right, I think I saw also like natural, not just man-made buildings or anything. It also includes the natural world, so things that we don't wanna, unfortunately, we have to talk about bomb. And then when you were mentioning ISIS in Syria, I remember hearing about this, like, deliberately targeting, and I had assumed, because I wasn't paying enough attention, that it was just like, oh, not just, but like, oh, religious places of really significance, but these are like, no, these are actual designated locations that are not to be touched, and
Yeah.
everyone kind of agrees on that, and how dark it is that they target that to inflict even more pain in war.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was of course fascinated by the backstory of this treaty. Signed in 1954. So you have to think this comes immediately in the wake of the Second World War, and just the destruction that was wrought across Europe and also across Asia as well, and North Africa as well. I don't want to leave out that war torn region as well, but between the Germans who deliberately, target sites of cultural and historic meaning in their bombing campaigns, in 1939 and 1940, in the Netherlands and Poland and France and England, but then also their deliberate looting of museums, of private collections of works of art as well, part of this, treaty that's going to be created to try to protect those resources. And then, of course, the Allies play a role in this too by just absolutely pummeling German cities, and not just German cities, also they're targeting parts of France with industrial importance to the German war effort during World War II, parts of Italy, Austria, parts of the Balkans as well. And these massive bombing raids caused intense destruction. And then while the United States did not deliberately target cities as part of its bombing campaign, kind of strategic bombing that we have talked about in previous episodes of the podcast, cities inevitably were damaged. And then also the British deliberately did have a campaign to destroy German cities and their civilian populations to inflict what they hoped for a war-ending strike against Nazi Germany. But in the course of that, how many amazing, beautiful pieces of art and the architecture of cities like Dresden are just wiped off the face of the planet. And so a decade after, a little less than a decade after the war ends, there is this kind of need, an agreement among the world that these sites need to be protected and that this can never happen again. This, indiscriminate destruction of cultural heritage during conflict. And so it's, I think it's like tied to the Monuments Men bit. So if you've seen that movie too, like this is part of it, or read the book, that effort to recover all of that lost art, that stolen art from the Nazis, that's a part of this too. I mean, there's going to be participants in the art world that are going to be involved in the creation of this treaty, in the pursuit of protecting these sites in times of future conflict. But just like everything else in our world now, as we are rolling back all of the kind of agreements and norms and the treaties and alliances and agreements that have been in place since the end of the Second World War are all kind of being rolled back. And I think this is one of those cases where we're probably going to see more of this than less of it in the future as we kind of enter into this, new age of conflict around the world, whether it's, Ukraine or Iran, these large, massive conflicts, the biggest we've seen since, in decades, certainly 2 decades for the United States since the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, a couple of things that I was thinking about when you were talking about recovering the art. First of all, I always think about that Band of Brothers episode when they go to the Eagle's Nest and there's just so much stuff up there that Hitler was just stashing because he decided he wanted all of the art for himself. And how it was an agreement, because when you're talking about these sites and you're talking about preserving them, the opposite would be like the annihilation of their culture. And I was
Mm-hmm.
just thinking about that, why that treaty was put in place was because, I mean, it's not just war, it's literally wiping something off the map and off of
Yeah.
history for the future. And it's so devastating. And how, to your final point about where we are now, a lot of things aren't being followed, it seems. A lot of like rules, common decency, order that has been established so we don't go into another world war. Those things are not being followed. So why would this one be followed? Is kind of
Yeah.
the cynical take on it. And it seems like it won't be. And not to be
Mm-hmm.
dark, but another building that was hit was a school
Yeah.
full of children. So like
Yeah.
it's infuriating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely, it's hard to watch. It's hard to see all of this. And yeah, I wanted to pivot this over to kind of some other historic thoughts around this, and ties back to that last major conflict, the last time we had a major buildup of military forces like this in the Middle East with the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Of course, that's built on the idea of going after Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. An entire case built for that, which fizzled upon invasion and weapons inspectors looking for these supposed weapons of mass destruction that turned out they didn't exist. In this conflict, we have none of that buildup at all. No preparation, no address, no case for this war. In fact, our government seems to be to be unable to define what the purpose of this conflict is for or why it started. Just something I'm seeing a lot, quite frequently, is this constant drumbeat of, well, we're not going to nation build, we're not going to put troops on the ground. And I think what a lot of people have forgotten is that's exactly what was being said in 2002 and 2003 with the idea of like, yes, there will be boots on the ground, but the idea was that they were going to go in, take down Saddam, take down the government, and then leave. And of course, we know that didn't happen. We still have troops in Iraq. And while over 2 decades later, things have settled down, it was, how many thousands of American lives were lost, let alone the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives that were lost in the conflict, and the whole region put into absolute turmoil that has reshaped the Middle East and created much of the chaos of the last 20 years. I would say I've been reading back through old newspapers from 2003 as the insurgency began, civil war began in Iraq in the months after we invaded, and it's a little bit like, oh gosh, I really hope that that's not a repeat. We're not going to see this descent into chaos, but I'm very concerned by what we're seeing, and the fact that there is not really an end game being planned here.
Yeah, or a beginning game, to your point. I feel
Yeah, there's
like
no.
I don't know what the game is. I think that it is eerily similar, like, "Oh, wait, we've been here before." And yes, it was, "Oh, we're only gonna be here for a couple months tops, couple weeks,
Mhm,
couple months," and then years and years and years and years and years later. But now we don't even have any explanation or
mhm.
any reasoning or anyone singing from the same sheet of music. At least, okay, I don't know where you were back in this day in Pennsylvania, what grade you were in. But I was in high school and this was like post obviously 9/11 and I mean, nationalism was high, patriotism was high. And so it was almost like everyone got caught up in it and a lot of people were in favor and it was popular, although like as angsty teens, we were very not. But this is so dissimilar because
Mhm.
nobody knows why we're going. There's no good reason or rationale. And not only that, but the administration has said a billion times the Iraq war was a huge mistake. We don't want to do that. And it seems like we're doing that.
Yeah.
It's so strange.
Yeah, it's like they've believed their own propaganda a bit, where it's, the ideas that they're espousing, this no nation building, this, just this, like, again, no boots on the ground. This conflict will be over in 4 to 5 weeks. It just neglects the fact of like, okay, you've decapitated this regime. You've killed the Ayatollah. You've killed many of the other leaders of the Iranian government. But I will say, even more historical thoughts, like the Ayatollahs come around because that's a blowback from us, taking down their government in the 1950s. So we bear responsibility for their rise to power in the first place.
Which we do many times for every single situation. I mean, put in Afghanistan, put in like all of it. So yes, keep going.
Yeah, yeah, longstanding consequences of that. But, ultimately, like, what happens if the government falls? What happens if, the power's off? There's no running water. You have a country of 90 million people, without a government, without leadership. What happens if that descends into chaos? Where do all those refugees go? The millions of people who could go fleeing out of the country. Where do they go, and how much do they destabilize the entire region? The consequences of this, like when you open Pandora's box, like they have, the conflict of this size and scale, with no real planning for what comes next, it's a recipe for disaster. This happened in 2003. This is one of the things that I was 10 years old, when the invasion of Iraq happened. So I was like one of those kids that's like, I'm up at night watching the news of like, we're bombing Baghdad and it's live on CNN, kind of
Mhm.
situation where it's like, 10-year-old me does not have a full grasp of the consequences of what is happening. But subsequently, like reading about the run up to war, and the analysis of what happens and how the country is allowed to descend into chaos, it's like, there was all these phases of planning, of war planning, before going into Iraq. And there's the buildup, there's the actual execution of the invasion, there's the bombing campaign that goes before that to prepare for the ground invasion and toppling of the regime. But then there's phase four, and I will always remember this, of like, phase four was what comes next. And then everyone gets to the part where phase four begins, and everyone looks around, and no one had planned for phase four. Everyone had looked
Mm.
around and were like, oh, they're responsible for phase four. And no one was. So the country is just left in this chaotic mess. And meanwhile, an insurgency begins, and then the Bush administration denies for months that there is a problem, until, bombs start exploding and American soldiers start dying and diplomats start dying. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we do have a problem, and it's going to devolve into uh, a bloody civil war, a sectarian civil war. Those are consequences that, in the run up to the conflict, the Bush administration just, that was not something that they ever foresaw. They saw us leaving. Mission accomplished. They were planning to get out and leave behind a democratic Iraq. But I think this is a lesson for the unintended consequences of an action of this size and scale, that can lead to consequences years, decades down the line.
And it seems so arbitrary on how it's being spoken about. I will say, at least by our Secretary of War, um, who
Defense.
I was, yes, war was, my eyebrows were raised very, very high. Was, I believe the quotes were like, "This isn't a regime change, but the regime did change." Like it's almost like an SNL skit.
Yeah.
of all of these major things, this like ripple effect of these things have consequences. What is this? You mentioned the refugee crisis. Like, are we taking in those people? Well,
No.
no, we're not. They're not
Yeah.
allowed in our country, and we're over there displacing people potentially. So it seems there's not a plan there. You could never plan for this, but there's not even a beginning of a plan.
Yeah. There's not even
It
a reason for
no.
this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah.
Those are some thoughts that we have.
I feel like this I do not mean to say this, but like it's just I keep thinking about they have not there's no respect for any order or rules or treaties anymore. Like why would the World Heritage sites be honored in this day and age and what that means moving forward? Like are these things just
Hmm.
going to be annihilated off the map? Are these like really significant places going to be gone?
Yeah.
As well as humans, which is, my naive brain was like, why can't we designate everything a World Heritage site and everyone just hands off and be cool?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit too. It's like, I think what's the quote, in the lead up to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, it's, about the in a country where they burn books, inevitably people will burn as well. And I think that's
Mhm.
a situation here that's kind of a framing for this of like, if you're willing to destroy culture and history and the heritage of a people and a country and a place, you also are just so willing to destroy the people of that place as well. I think it's something that we're going to have to contend with as we continue into the 21st century, into the middle part of this century, as we are repeatedly forgetting the lessons of the past from the mid 20th century, which was the bloodiest time in human history. You know, I think this hope that we all had that as we developed and became more technologically savvy and reliant, that we would be able to leave these kinds of issues and conflicts behind. And it's just becoming very clear that the further we get into this century, the more, the value of human life seems to be decreasing markedly day after day. And every one of these conflicts that begins, these actions against refugees, what's happening among the Palestinian people, the events of October 7th going the other direction as well. I think that we are in a really dangerous time. And unlike the 20th century, the mid 20th century and the Second World War until the very end, there are nuclear weapons, a sword of Damocles hanging over all of our heads. And I think that our government seems to have forgotten that that's still a threat. And the fact that escalation and drawing in of countries in the region, places like Pakistan that are nuclear armed, could have consequences that lead towards nuclear conflict. And that held off a world war for 80 years. And I don't know how much longer that genie, the nuclear genie, is going to be kept in the bottle. And that's a scary thought. This is the doom and gloom podcast for sure. I think we've reached peak doom and gloom now. You're
Yeah.
welcome, everybody.
Yeah.
But it's something to keep in mind, at least amongst us,
Yeah.
even though maybe the administration and the government in charge of the United States may not be thinking about it.
Yeah. It's fun. It's not funny. I forget what I was listening to, but they brought up Pakistan and I was like, oh, right. This is terrifying.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. There's hope. Do you know why? Because World War II was the worst thing that had happened, right? At that point. And then everyone came together, and the United States did eventually in 2009 when they got on board. But everyone came together. Well, the United States was on board with this part, that we're not going to do that.
Mhm.
And even if we're at a place now where things get really bad, there's going to be people after, hopefully, that say we're not going to do that anymore because the pendulum always swings back to decency and compassion and intelligence, and so humanity will prevail. But Yeah, this is a really dark time, but I think I want to be one amongst the people that are after that are like, wait a minute, we gotta protect all this again.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hopeful that we can avoid that, at least for this situation in this time period. But yeah, I think it's just something that we have to like hold in our minds. And I wish more of our leaders would hold that in their minds too, and just understand the consequences and the potential consequences of their actions and their words too. We used to care about what our leaders said and how they said it. We don't anymore. It doesn't seem like that's a value that the American people care about. That being said, this is an unpopular war. So, I think very much that this could become a major issue in upcoming elections. And the fact that, the American service members are being put in harm's way for what? Why are they there? Why are people dying? And our government has failed to answer those questions so far. And we'll see if they are able to answer those questions. I have some real doubts about that moving forward. But it does give me hope that the fact that the majority of Americans are opposed to this conflict, as they should be.
Yeah. Yeah, when they were showing the images, names, hometowns of I think it was 6 now at this point that were
Mhm.
killed in Kuwait, service members, took me right back to Iraq and Afghanistan and getting those notifications, and my brother was over there, and it just is like, "What are we doing here, guys?"
Yep. And yeah, it seems like those open wounds, for some at least, from that conflict those wounds have been forgotten.
They've
And
been
unfortunately, we're going to have to redo some of that now in 2026.
This is why you should be a student of history, folks,
Yep.
because if you learn about it, you don't wanna do it anymore. You don't wanna do the mistake.
Yep. Yep. It's true. It's true. So now that those of you that are students of history, we're all doomed to watch everybody else repeat the mistakes of the
I was gonna
past.
say
It's a special kind of hell.
it's a really bad time to be a historian right now.
Well, I think, Molly, we're going to leave it there.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back with more episodes in the future. If you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast, go ahead and do that now, and be sure to leave us a rating and a review or a comment. Let us know what you think about this episode, and we'll be back to talk to you again soon.
Bye.